Hey gang, back to the Imaginarium. I'm Dr. G. Here we explore fantasy fiction and dreams and the mind. So the First Law Trilogy. First Law Trilogy is a trilogy of books by Joe Abercrombie. It follows several characters in an obviously late medieval Europe inspired fantasy setting. And like most epic fantasy these days, it skips around across large areas of territory, covering many characters that all converge more or less in a major climax at the end. However, Abercrombie adds his own twist by deliberately including a number of popular fantasy tropes and then inverting them with a creative twist. You have, for example, a mighty war hero who was captured and tortured for years, becomes a shadow of his former self, and is then relegated to being a torturer for the religious powers of the empire, thus inflicting what was inflicted on him. You have a mysterious wizard who aids the heroes, but has a number of dark secrets of his own. You have a powerful berserker who has a very troubled past and is seeking redemption. You have a cocky champion who has to undergo a sort of hero's journey, but then this winds up turning out completely in a different way that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Abercrombie's story is often categorized as grimdark, and though those sorts of vague descriptors are destined, I think, to be endlessly debated online, I think it is fairly apt in this case. But I think a more useful label for this would be tragic. It appeals to tragedy in terms of what's good about it, but also what can be difficult about tragedy. So I'm going to get into that in a minute. But the first thing to think about here is, will you like it? So let me go through my usual rounds here. In terms of the plot and the pace, the First Law Trilogy is very character-driven, meaning that Abercrombie likes to spend enough time with his characters for us to really kind of understand what they're about. Some may find that this makes the pace drag a little, but I felt like he struck a good balance, mainly because the characters he has us spend so much time with are very well constructed. More on them in a moment. Again, this isn't like Mervyn Peake, where we spend a really long time with the characters, but not really doing anything, rather just sort of showing us how bizarre they are. Abercrombie doesn't do that here. But more on them in a minute. The plot here is actually quite a bit less convoluted and jumpy than you get in a lot of epic fantasy, and I really like that about this series. I was always oriented. I always felt like I understood where I was and who was trying to accomplish what, and I thought it was organically done. There wasn't a whole lot of head hopping and character multiplying that you see in some series. Every scene that you have, we had a good sense of what the goals of the POV character were and what they were trying to do and why. You never really get the, okay, who are these guys and what the heck are they doing and why do I care kind of effect that you sometimes get in other series like Malazan, but never mind that. I do love Malazan. Anyway, Abercrombie is interested in using, in terms of plot, the common fantasy tropes that you see in order to really twist them hard. Now, I think this could very easily be quite annoying and pretentious, but thankfully Abercrombie avoids this pitfall, and the trope subversion never feels forced or contrived, and it feels organic to the story. So what about those characters? Abercrombie at this point is pretty famous for strongly drawn characters. And I've mentioned elsewhere where I don't care much for the term morally gray because it usually winds up invoking these sort of irritating edgelord nonsense characters that ventures into pure wish fulfillment. In any case, Abercrombie avoids that and makes his characters what I like to call multicolored rather than just smearing them with a bunch of gray. These are very conflicted and multifaceted individuals. They're very flawed, but also each of them is oddly likable in their own way, or at least if they're not likable, they're interesting. Sandan Glokta, for example, he is not likable, and yet he chews up every scene he is in, not only because he is such a train wreck of a person, but because he has this very acerbic wit and razor sharp sense of humor. And again, that by itself might not be enough, but even though he's very despicable, the story of how he became so despicable is so horrendous that Abercrombie kind of makes us wonder if we might not end up like that in the same way if we'd suffered the horrible fate that he did. So for that, he becomes very fascinating as a character. The tone here is a very adult themed fantasy, meaning that there's a lot of stuff in here that is not for kids. But at the same time, it never felt to me like it was descending into just sort of luridness that you get with that. Sometimes adult fantasy means that somebody included a lot of blood and gore and sex in what is otherwise a fairly standard story, but just sort of glomming it on top of it, just so they can say it's adult. But that's not really what's going on here. There is a lot of awful stuff that happens, and there's a lot of very kind of dark events that occur, but it's never feels to me like it's self-consciously edgy, like it's just trying to get an R rating, for the heck of it. Rather, I think he captures some of the more complexities of what an adult fantasy really can do without falling into that pitfall. At the same time, he also captures some of the magic of fantasy at the same time, which I really was kind of surprised at. In our first introduction to Baez and the Magi as a group, we're pretty impressed with their magical abilities, and you get that sense of awe and wonder that sometimes is missing in fantasy. The imagery on the Sando Peak scale lands right around the 6 to 7 range. If you're not familiar with that, I like to rate books in terms of how they like to describe scenery and character. And on one end, you've got Sando, who is very straightforward and no nonsense, very simple. On the other end, you've got Mervyn Peake in his Gormenghast series, which just goes on and on and on and on and on. It's extremely vivid and really striking, but it can wear on some people. So where you land on that is kind of a personal choice. But in any case here, I don't think Abercrombie writes scenes that feel like white rooms, and he never descends into talking head syndrome. So I think that's good. And the scene dressing is actually used to convey backstory and character, so it's kind of double duty. So it's efficient and effective. The world building might be the only slightly weaker area here. I think Abercrombie's more interested in crafting interesting characters than filling in all the details of his world, which is good in one sense, but you may miss that if you're a big kind of world building nerd. And the world here is quite straightforward. It works. It's very obviously inspired by historical Europe, but don't expect to be wowed by it. He doesn't use his setting in a way to convey theme that the way the best fantasies often can do, like, say, Earthsea. But at the same time, because he's using a setting that resembles our own history, that lends its own sort of allegorical flavors to it that I think you might miss if you're not looking closely. And a lot of the allegorical statements he makes about our own world are kind of cynical as well, so just be on guard for that. The magic is powerful, but it's quite limited. It's not explained in a whole lot of detail. I think it works really well here because most of the characters, almost all of them, are non-magical, the POV characters. So you have magical characters, but you don't see scenes described from their point of view, which I think it works quite well here because he's going for this kind of gritty tone where most of the characters are struggling with their own to make their way in the world, and they don't have access to great powers, and so he shows it from that point of view, which means that there's not massive amounts of magic flying around and that kind of thing. So what about the story and the psyche? Like, what is the intersection here for me? And I think here it's really about this grimdark stuff and the elements of tragedy. I think that element is very well done in this trilogy. Tragedies, of course, have been around for a very long time, so much so that the classical writers, like the ancient Greeks, worked out a number of rules for how you're supposed to write them. Aristotle, for example, in his Poetics, described several rules for how to write a good tragedy. Most of them are very tried and true. Shakespeare followed a lot of them, for example. In any case, in a tragedy, you have a good character starting out from a position of power and moral goodness, and often descending into madness, chaos, evil, destruction, devastation, or whatever. And it's usually due to things of their own making, their own flaws, or maybe it can just be because fate is inexorable. And therefore, the endings of tragedies are not happy ones. This is, I think, kind of paradoxical, at least seemingly so, because you think this would be very depressing to watch and people wouldn't want to watch them, but that's not the case. Tragedies are among the most beloved works of fiction in history. Shakespeare, for example, if you look at Hamlet, Hamlet ends in total disaster. Nearly every main character dies at the end, and it's all due to a tangle of treacheries and mistakes and ill intentions. So what is the point of this? Why is this powerful? Why do we tell stories like this as humans? Well, I can say one thing, it's not nihilism. Okay, there's a huge difference between tragedy and nihilism. Some people, I think, conflate the two. And for example, I even mentioned that I liked the First Law trilogy in one of my videos, and somebody jumped on and said, well, that's proof that I'm evil, which is utterly stupid and absurd. But it's, I think, a result of this conflation between something that is tragic in tone and intention rather than nihilistic. And yet, even nihilistic stories have their place, I think. They're not fun to read, really, but they are there for a reason, and those exist as well. I'm not a huge fan of them myself, but that's kind of a personal preference. What we're seeing in tragedy and the catharsis that comes from tragedy is that you're witnessing the consequences of characters' poorly thought out actions and choices. Or maybe you're seeing a lesson in acceptance of things beyond our power to control. Thus, there is a huge amount of meaning that's conveyed by tragedy. And this instance, it's not by supporting a theme that is expressed in the positive, but through the negation of it. For example, greed, bloodlust, overweening pride, or feeling sorry for oneself, even if seemingly justified, those sorts of things in a tragedy will be shown to lead us to disaster. And that's a common message in a tragedy, for example. Lust for power, for example, in Macbeth, is what led Macbeth to absolute destruction. If a story were truly nihilistic, it wouldn't be that way. The story would argue that no matter what we did, random chaos would happen to us and there would be no logic or meaning to any of it. That's nihilism. I actually really don't like these kind of stories. And I didn't get this feeling from the First Law trilogy. I have from others, and we don't need to get into that. But in contrast to that, I understood, I think, the moral arguments that Abercrombie was making here through the tragic ends of most of his characters. And it felt powerful and cathartic. So final take is my own rating. I give it 5 Dreamstones out of 5. I loved it. I really love Stephen Pace's incredible narration for the audiobook. It was very entertaining and thoughtful, as well as frequently hilarious, despite the dark tone. So that's what I have for you. Make sure to check out my own fantasy novel, King of the Forgotten Darkness. It is in the description. You can go check that out, get the reviews on it. So far, it's doing pretty good, and I'm very, very happy and love to share that. So until next time, I will see you later.